Early winter, 1943. Washington moved under a gray, heavy sky as President Franklin Roosevelt prepared for a journey no American leader had ever taken. His hands shook more than before. His doctors noticed he could no longer hide the strain in his voice. But the war was reaching a point where hesitation meant more coffins, more telegrams, and more sons who would never come home. Across the Atlantic, the Red Army pushed the German front back mile by mile. Entire divisions collapsed under Soviet pressure. Every new Soviet advance shifted the balance of power in ways the White House could not ignore. Roosevelt understood that whoever held the ground at the end of the war would shape the peace that followed. American commanders pushed for a decision. Congress demanded clarity on strategy. Families wanted victory, not promises. Roosevelt faced the war with a body that was failing him and a world that refused to wait. He needed to meet the two men who could determine how fast the war would end: Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. The location was Tehran. The stakes could not have been higher. Tehran, in November 1943, was a city wrapped in tension. Soviet troops patrolled the streets. Intelligence reports warned of assassination plots. The air felt thick, as if the entire world had paused to see what the three most powerful men on Earth would decide. Roosevelt arrived exhausted but determined to show he was still the center of the Allied alliance. Stalin arrived confident, backed by victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and a tide of Soviet momentum no one could deny. Churchill arrived wary, protective of Britain's shrinking leverage, already sensing that the future belonged to Washington and Moscow. Inside the Soviet embassy, Roosevelt delivered an opening that surprised Churchill. He spoke directly to Stalin. He praised the Red Army. He pressed for cooperation. He chose warmth over confrontation. This was not a mistake or softness. It was a calculation made under wartime pressure. If Stalin felt cornered, he might refuse cooperation in Europe, and refuse to help against Japan. Stalin watched Roosevelt closely. The Soviet leader understood the power of timing. He knew Roosevelt needed him, and he knew the president was already carrying more weight than his doctors allowed him to admit. The first major clash came quickly. Churchill argued to continue operations through Italy and the Balkans. He believed saving Eastern Europe from Soviet control required British presence in the south. His vision was strategic, long-term, and deeply shaped by fears of Soviet expansion. Stalin rejected it at once. He demanded a full-scale invasion of France. He wanted the Western Allies to absorb the kind of casualties the Red Army had taken for 2 brutal years. A second front in France would pull German divisions away from the east and speed the collapse of Hitler's armies. Roosevelt listened to both men. But the war, the losses, and the pressure for a decisive blow shaped his choice. He sided with Stalin. Operation Overlord, D-Day, was set for 1944. Churchill was stunned. Stalin was satisfied. And Roosevelt had made the first deal that would echo far beyond the beaches of Normandy. Not because he was weak, but because he calculated that a faster end to the war was worth the cost. He needed Stalin for Japan. He needed the alliance intact. The decision set the pattern for what would follow on the road to Yalta. Roosevelt entered Tehran knowing one truth that shaped every decision he made. The war in Europe could end within a year, but the war in the Pacific could cost America hundreds of thousands of lives. The Joint Chiefs warned that taking the Japanese home islands might require an invasion on a scale no American family was prepared to imagine. Roosevelt carried that estimate in his briefcase. He carried the weight of it in his expression. Stalin knew it. Behind every discussion about Europe, Roosevelt looked toward the Pacific. He needed Soviet help against Japan. He needed the Red Army to join the fight once Germany collapsed. Without that help, the United States would bleed alone on beaches with names no one wanted to learn. Stalin understood the leverage. He never said it directly. He didn't have to. Every time Roosevelt pressed for cooperation, the Soviet leader listened with calm confidence, as if the answer was already settled in his favor. Churchill noticed it. American advisors noticed it, and Roosevelt felt it more clearly than he admitted. The bargain was unstated, but unmistakable. If Stalin agreed to help against Japan, Roosevelt would have to be flexible elsewhere. Tehran was not the place where the deal was written. It was the place where the price began to rise. By early 1944, Roosevelt's health had entered a quiet crisis. He hid it from the public, from Congress, even from many of the men who had served beside him for years. Photographs caught his face thinning. His hands trembled more often. His doctors warned him to rest. The war refused to wait. the Soviet advance accelerated. By summer, Soviet armies were pouring through Eastern Europe. Romania, Bulgaria, and much of Poland were falling under Soviet control. Every mile the Red Army gained gave Stalin something no piece of paper from Tehran could match: facts on the ground. Roosevelt watched the maps change in daily briefings. He saw borders shifting as fast as the German front collapsed. He knew the Allies could liberate Western Europe, but Eastern Europe was slipping beyond Western reach. Churchill fought to keep influence in the Balkans. Roosevelt focused on defeating Hitler and ending the war with Japan. The two goals moved on different tracks, and Stalin watched the gap widen. The president pushed forward anyway. He prepared for the next meeting. He hoped his presence could stabilize the alliance long enough to secure a workable peace. But the pressure was rising, and his time was running out faster than anyone around him fully understood. London saw danger long before Yalta appeared on any calendar. Churchill believed that if the Western Allies didn't shape Eastern Europe, Stalin would. He wrote private letters. He pressed Roosevelt during long conversations. He urged the president to see that Soviet power was not temporary, and that every Soviet soldier crossing a new frontier would become a permanent reminder of Moscow's reach. Roosevelt heard him, but wartime priorities pulled in another direction. America carried the full weight of the Pacific War. It produced more equipment, more landing craft, and more aircraft than the rest of the world combined. The burden was enormous, and Roosevelt believed the best path forward was a working partnership with Stalin. Difficult, tense, but necessary. Stalin watched the split between the two Western leaders widen. He rarely needed to push. The pressure of two separate wars did the work for him. When he remained silent, he gained leverage. When he spoke, he shaped expectations. His armies kept advancing. His political officers planted Soviet-backed committees in every liberated city east of the Vistula. Bit by bit, the future map of Europe began to tilt. Roosevelt prepared for the next meeting. Churchill grew more anxious. Stalin waited with the advantage of victory. Yalta was coming, and with it the most consequential negotiations of the war. By January 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing faster than anyone predicted. The Red Army smashed through Poland, crossed the Vistula, and pushed straight toward the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. Stalin's armies were not advancing. They were sweeping across entire nations. City after city fell behind them. Every new Soviet victory pushed the conference clock forward. The Western Allies were still fighting through the Ardennes. They had not stepped foot inside Germany. They were far from Berlin, far from shaping the political future of Eastern Europe, and far from any position to challenge Soviet control on the ground. Roosevelt read the daily maps in the White House map room. Each briefing made one fact louder. The post-war order would be decided partly by diplomacy, but mostly by armies already occupying territory. Time was not on Roosevelt's side. His health was declining. His doctors knew it. His closest advisors saw it every day, but the president refused to slow down. He believed he had one last mission: stabilize the alliance long enough to secure a workable peace and secure Soviet help in the Pacific. Yalta was set for early February. Roosevelt could not postpone it. Churchill feared it. Stalin prepared for it with the confidence of a man whose armies had already drawn the new borders of Europe. The race toward Yalta was not a sprint. It was a convergence of collapsing timelines: Roosevelt's health, Stalin's momentum, and the need to end a global war with decisions that could not be undone. Yalta in February 1945 was cold, quiet, and heavily guarded. Soviet troops lined the coastal roads leading to the Livadia Palace, the former summer residence of the Romanovs, now converted into a secure conference site. Delegates from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union arrived, surrounded by layers of NKVD security. Roosevelt entered the palace in his wheelchair, visibly weak and noticeably thinner than he had been just months earlier. Photographs from the first day confirm how much his health had declined. Advisors stayed close, but Roosevelt maintained his composure and tried to project confidence despite his fatigue. Stalin arrived with the authority of a leader whose armies were closing in on Berlin. Reports from American diplomats at Yalta describe him as calm, focused, and fully in control of his delegation. He carried the advantage of recent victories, and everyone in the room understood it. Churchill entered determined but concerned about the speed of the Soviet advance across Eastern Europe. His personal correspondence from the time shows clear worry that Britain's influence was shrinking as Soviet troops established control in capital after capital. The atmosphere in the opening session reflected the military realities of early 1945, Roosevelt's declining health, Churchill's strategic anxiety, and Stalin's battlefield momentum shaped the tone of every conversation that followed. No dramatic gestures were recorded, no confrontational moments marked the opening. The power imbalance was visible without being spoken aloud. Yalta began under those conditions, three leaders meeting at a critical moment, each carrying a different kind of pressure, and each aware that the decisions made here would outlast the war itself. Poland became the central issue at Yalta because it represented far more than a single country. It was the gateway to Eastern Europe, and by early 1945 it was fully under Red Army control. Stalin had installed the Lublin Committee as a provisional government, and Soviet security forces were already shaping the political landscape on the ground. Roosevelt and Churchill understood that their leverage was limited. The Western Allies had no troops in Poland, and no military ability to influence events there. Churchill pressed hard for the restoration of the Polish government in exile in London and for genuinely free elections, but his arguments had little weight against the facts established by Soviet occupation. Roosevelt faced a different pressure. The war with Japan was still ahead, and American planners estimated enormous casualties if the United States had to invade the Japanese home islands alone. Roosevelt believed that Soviet entry into the Pacific War could shorten the conflict and save countless American lives. That requirement shaped his decisions at Yalta. The negotiations over Poland moved toward compromise. Roosevelt agreed to the Curzon Line as Poland's new eastern border, effectively accepting Soviet territorial gains. He also accepted that the Lublin Committee would form the basis of a restructured Polish government, though he insisted on including some members of the London group. The final language on elections, free and unfettered, was intentionally broad. Stalin accepted it, knowing it gave him room to interpret events his own way once the Western delegations had departed. This became the most consequential concession Roosevelt made. It reflected the strategic trade-off of 1945. Ending the war with Japan required cooperation from a leader whose armies already controlled Eastern Europe. Beyond Poland, the broader question of Eastern Europe followed the same pattern. By the time Yalta began, Soviet forces occupied Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Eastern Germany, and much of Czechoslovakia. What happened in these territories depended far more on the Red Army than on diplomatic agreements. Roosevelt and Churchill pushed for political openness, representative governments, and post-war stability based on cooperation. They emphasized democratic principles, but both understood the limitations. Without Western troops in Eastern Europe, they could not enforce these demands. Stalin listened, agreed to general statements, and avoided commitments that would restrict Soviet influence. The wording that emerged, phrases like broadly representative and responsive to the will of the people, reflected long discussions but ultimately gave Moscow wide discretion. Churchill pushed harder than Roosevelt, warning that Soviet dominance could shape the region for decades. Roosevelt focused on maintaining the wartime alliance long enough to finish the war. His priority was preventing a breakdown that might disrupt the fight against Germany or jeopardize Soviet participation against Japan. The final agreements captured the diplomatic intentions of the West but not the military realities on the ground. Stalin left Yalta with political flexibility across Eastern Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill left with the hope that cooperation would survive the end of the war. The final major negotiation at Yalta concerned the war still unfolding in the Pacific. American military planners expected Japanese resistance to intensify as U.S. forces approached the home islands. The battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa were already demonstrating the scale of casualties the United States might face. Roosevelt believed that bringing the Soviet Union into the Pacific War could shorten the conflict. A Soviet offensive in Manchuria would put additional pressure on Japan's army and disrupt its ability to defend the mainland. Roosevelt also saw strategic value in preventing Japan from focusing entirely on American forces. Stalin understood the importance of his position and outlined the conditions for Soviet involvement. He sought the return of southern Sakhalin, control of the Kuril Islands, security interests in Manchurian ports and railways, and the restoration of earlier Russian influence in the region. These demands were significant, but they aligned with long-standing Soviet ambitions in the Far East. Roosevelt accepted the terms with the view that they were a necessary cost to accelerate the end of the war. He believed that Soviet participation could reduce the need for a massive American invasion and help force a Japanese surrender. Churchill supported the goal but was wary of expanding Soviet influence into Asia. The agreement was concluded without public attention. Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan 90 days after Germany's defeat, a timeline that later proved accurate. The concessions Roosevelt made at Yalta would shape the final stages of the Pacific War and influence post-war politics in Northeast Asia. By the final days of the conference, the major outlines of the agreements were set. The documents reflected long negotiations, differing priorities, and the immense weight of wartime realities. At Yalta, the leaders formalized plans for the United Nations, confirmed the occupation zones for post-war Germany, outlined reparations, and set broad political principles for the countries liberated from Nazi control. Roosevelt viewed the agreements as a pragmatic effort to keep the alliance functioning until the war ended. He believed that collaboration in establishing the United Nations would create a framework strong enough to prevent another global conflict. He also saw Stalin's signed commitment to enter the war against Japan as essential to shortening the Pacific campaign. Churchill signed with reservations. His letters to London reveal concern about the future of Eastern Europe and the limited Western influence over events already unfolding under Soviet occupation. But he also recognized that the Red Army's presence made many issues beyond negotiation. Stalin signed confidently, aware that the military situation favored him. His acceptance of political language about elections and representative governments came at little cost, as these terms were flexible enough to interpret later. The agreements captured both the cooperation that won the war and the contradictions that would shape the peace. All three leaders believed they had secured the best possible terms under the circumstances. None could fully see how quickly these papers would become the basis for future disagreements. The conference ended in February 1945. Within weeks, events moved faster than any of the leaders could have anticipated. The Red Army advanced deeper into Eastern Europe, and Soviet-backed governments solidified their control. Local opposition was weakened or dismantled by security forces. In Washington, Roosevelt returned to a schedule far beyond his physical limits. His health continued to decline. His doctors urged rest, but the final months of the war demanded constant decisions. Germany's collapse, Japan's resistance, the formation of the United Nations, and the implementation of the Yalta agreements. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died suddenly in Warm Springs, Georgia. His death came only 2 months after Yalta, and before he could see how the post-war order was unfolding. His absence left a void in American leadership at a critical moment. Stalin moved quickly to consolidate the Soviet position. Elections promised in Yalta were postponed, reshaped, or controlled. Opposition parties in Poland and elsewhere faced pressure, restrictions, or removal. The governments formed in these countries increasingly aligned with Moscow. Churchill expressed alarm, but Britain no longer had the leverage it once held. With Roosevelt gone, the responsibility to interpret and act upon the Yalta agreements fell to the new American president, a man who had not been involved in the negotiations and had little understanding of their subtleties. The transition set the stage for a profound reassessment of what had truly been agreed at Yalta. Harry Truman became president with almost no preparation for the foreign policy challenges awaiting him. He had not been included in major war decisions during his vice presidency, and he had never been briefed on the details of the negotiations at Tehran or Yalta. In the days after Roosevelt's death, he began reviewing the agreements line by line. As reports arrived from Eastern Europe, Truman saw a widening gap between the text of the agreements and Soviet behavior on the ground. American diplomats described opposition leaders being arrested, censored, or pressured. The political conditions envisioned at Yalta were not being carried out as Roosevelt had hoped. Truman asked for full briefings from the State Department and military leadership. For the first time, he began to understand the compromises Roosevelt had made, especially regarding Poland and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. He saw how the language of the agreements, intentionally broad to maintain cooperation, allowed Stalin to interpret his obligations narrowly. The new president faced a dilemma. The United States needed Soviet help to finish the Pacific War, but it also needed to defend the principles it had supported in Europe. Balancing those two goals became one of Truman's first major challenges in office. His reassessment of Yalta marked a turning point. It shaped his approach to Stalin, influenced his decision-making in the final months of the war, and helped define the early contours of what would soon be known as the Cold War. The journey from Tehran to Yalta reflected the pressures of a global war reaching its climax. Each leader arrived with different burdens, military, political, and personal, and each saw the post-war world through a different lens. Roosevelt sought cooperation long enough to finish the war and launch a lasting international order. Churchill sought to protect Europe from a new imbalance of power. Stalin sought security through control of territory and political systems aligned with Soviet interests. The agreements they reached were shaped as much by the armies occupying Europe as by the conversations inside the conference rooms. The Western Allies hoped that principles written on paper would guide post-war behavior. The Soviet Union relied on the authority of military presence. Roosevelt did not live to see how the decisions of early 1945 unfolded. Churchill witnessed his warnings materialize. Truman inherited a world already shifting toward a new geopolitical divide. The choices made at Tehran and Yalta ended the war, but they also set the foundation for the world that followed, one shaped by cooperation in victory and tension in its aftermath.